Moscow, 10 Acker hours. The conference room was silent, a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that weighed on the chest, made breathing difficult. A long table dominated the room, surrounded by men in dark suits. At the head of the table sat General Alexei Popov, head of the Russian Space Agency. His face was lined with worry, his eyes bloodshot, sleepless. "We can't let it happen again," he said, his voice low, steady. "We can't lose another cosmonaut." The men around the table nodded, their faces grave, their eyes downcast. The memory of Yuri's death was fresh, raw. They had all seen the footage, the desperate scramble to retrieve the supplies, the final collapse in the airlock. It was a wound that would take time to heal if it ever did. "We need solutions," Popov said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Real solutions. No more shortcuts. No more risks." One of the advisors, a thin man with a sharp face and deep-set eyes, cleared his throat. "General, the problem is the resupply process itself. The current system is too fragile. One failure, and we lose everything." Popov nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Go on." The man leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "We need redundancy, a safety net. If one supply ship fails, there should be another option. We need to build a space station, one that orbits the moon." A murmur ran through the room, low voices filled with surprise, skepticism. Popov held up a hand, silencing them. "A space station?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Why?" The advisor leaned back, his eyes meeting Popov's. "It would act as a staging ground. Supplies would be sent there first. From the station, we could send smaller, more manageable shipments down to the lunar surface." Popov frowned, his fingers drumming on the table. "And if the station itself fails?" Another voice, a gruff older man with a scar across his cheek, cut in. "We build a backup habitat on the surface, a secondary base, stocked with supplies. If the main base fails, the crew could relocate there." Popov nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "A backup habitat?" The room fell silent again, the weight of the idea settling over them. It was a monumental task, building a station in lunar orbit, a secondary habitat on the surface. It would take time, money, resources, and there was no guarantee it would work. "Costs?" Popov asked, his eyes shifting to a younger man at the far end of the table. Anatoly Ivanov, the agency's chief financial officer. The man shifted in his seat, his face pale. "It will be expensive," he said, his voice hesitant. "Very expensive. We're talking billions, maybe more." Popov's eyes narrowed. "Can we afford it?" Ivanov swallowed, his eyes darting around the room. "Not with the current budget. We'd need more funding, a lot more." Popov leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "We'll get the funding. The government won't have a choice, not after what happened." Ivanov nodded, his face tense. "And the timeline? It will take years to build a station, a habitat. We're talking at least 5, maybe 10. "We don't have that long," Popov said, his voice firm. "We need something sooner. We can't leave the current crew up there without backup for years." A murmur of agreement ran through the room, heads nodding, voices whispering. They all knew the truth. The current system was a ticking time bomb. Another failure, and they could lose everyone. "What about a temporary solution?" the thin advisor said, his eyes sharp. "Something we can deploy quickly within months. A modular supply depot, maybe. Something simple, easy to deploy." Popov frowned, his fingers drumming on the table again. "A supply depot?" The advisor nodded, his eyes bright, eager. "Yes. We send up a series of small modules, each packed with supplies. Food, water, medical equipment. We place them in different locations on the surface, easily reachable from the base." Popov considered it, his eyes narrowing. It was a good idea, a practical one, but it was only a temporary fix. a band-aid on a gaping wound. "It could work," he said slowly. "But we still need the station, the habitat, something permanent." "We could do both," the older man with the scar said, his voice calm, measured. "Deploy the depot first, while we build the station and habitat. It would buy us time." Popov nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Yes, that could work. The room was silent again, the men watching him, waiting. They were scared, he knew. Scared of another failure, another loss. But they were also determined. They would not let this happen again. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm, decisive. "We'll do it. We'll build the station, the habitat, and we'll deploy the depot. Whatever it takes, we'll make sure our people are safe." The room erupted in a murmur of agreement, voices low but determined. They had a plan, a way forward. It would be difficult, maybe impossible, but they would try. "Get the designs ready," Popov said, his eyes shifting to the thin advisor. "I want them on my desk by tomorrow." The man nodded, his face pale but determined. "Yes, General. And you," Popov said, turning to Ivanov. "Find the money. I don't care how. We need this." Ivanov nodded, his face tight with worry. "Yes, General." "And you," Popov said, his eyes shifting to the older man with the scar. "Get the depot modules ready. I want them on the next launch." The man nodded, his eyes cold, determined. "Yes, General." Popov leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "And I want weekly reports. Progress, problems, everything. We can't afford any more surprises." "Yes, General." The room echoed, their voices firm, unified. Popov nodded, his eyes hard, unyielding. This was their mission now, their duty. They would build the station, the habitat. They would make sure their people were safe, whatever it took. 11 hours, design room. The thin advisor, Dmitry Volkov, stood in the design room, his eyes scanning the blueprints spread out before him. The station, the habitat, the depot modules. It was an enormous task, a monumental challenge. But they had no choice. "We need to streamline this," he said, his voice tense. "We don't have time for the usual procedures." The engineers nodded, their faces tight, worried. They all knew the stakes. One mistake, one delay, and they could lose everything. "We can cut down the station's size," one of the engineers said, his voice hesitant. "Make it smaller, more compact. Reduce the weight, the cost." Volkov nodded, his eyes scanning the blueprints. "Do it. And the habitat?" "We can use the same design as the main base," another engineer said. "Modify it for quick deployment. It won't be perfect, but it will work." "Good," Volkov said, his voice firm. "And the depot?" "We have the modules ready," a third engineer said. "They were meant for the Mars mission, but we can repurpose them. It'll take a few weeks, but we can do it." Volkov nodded, his eyes bright, determined. They had a plan, a way forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. They would make it work. "Get started," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "We don't have time to waste." The engineers nodded, their hands moving quickly, sketching, calculating. They would work day and night if they had to. They would not let this fail. 12 hours, financial office. Anatoly Ivanov sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The numbers were staggering. Billions, maybe more. They didn't have the money, not even close. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the reports, the budgets. They could cut costs here and there, reallocate funds from other projects, but it wouldn't be enough. "We'll need outside funding," he muttered, his voice low, strained. "Private investors, maybe, or international partnerships." He knew it was risky, dangerous even. The Russian government wouldn't like it. But they had no choice. They couldn't do this alone. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling. "Get me a list of potential investors," he said, his voice tense. "Anyone who's shown interest in space exploration, and find out if any other agencies have spare modules, equipment, anything we can use." The voice on the other end of the line hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "Just do it," Ivanov snapped, his voice sharp. "We need this, whatever it takes." He hung up, his eyes closing, his hands shaking. They would find the money. They had to. 13 hours. Command Center General Popov stood in the command center, his eyes on the screen. The crew on the moon, pale, gaunt, but alive. They had the supplies now. They would survive, for now. But the clock was ticking. The next resupply mission was weeks away, and there were no guarantees. One more failure, and they could lose everything. "We'll get you home," he whispered, his voice low, filled with determination. "We'll get you home."